What I want to do today is to indulge a bit more deeply into what, at least for myself, has been probably my most important discovery or whatever I stumbled upon, because this actually somehow framed everything that I have done since. What I will talk about is the basic line of this book on the pleasure principle in culture, illusions without owners. The English translation appeared a year ago, but the book is a bit older. I wrote it, published it in German in 2002, and so I will outline the basic line of thought of this book to you, but in the end I will also show you a little bit how some new developments come in that I have written down in this later book in German, unfortunately only in German, What Life is Worth Living For. But before I start, I wanted just to give you a rough image of the context in which I'm working, and to see a bit, to allow you to see a bit how I consider of my role as a philosopher who mainly teaches not other philosophers, but artists, designers, architects. That's what I do. I work at Linz University of Art and Industrial Design. And so I'm concerned with the role of the ideas in the creative process, and I have to see what ideas the artists come up with or what they are confronted with, and look if these ideas are helpful for their creative process or if they may also become an obstacle to it. So here you see, and I show you, so to say, my philosophical card. I consider myself as an Althusserian, and Louis Althusser has developed this with regard to the sciences, especially in his book Philosophy and Spontaneous Philosophy of the Scientists, where Althusser states that philosophy is far from being a benefit to every scientific enterprise. Philosophy is not a good that can only be beneficial to all the people who have the happiness or the luck to receive it, but quite to the contrary, philosophy can produce main obstacles to scientific practice. Althusser's point is here quite Bacheladian. His teacher Gaston Bachelard already pointed out that every scientific discovery, every new scientific method is in itself also a kind of philosophical invention or discovery, but very rarely it occurs that the scientists themselves find an adequate language for the philosophical invention that they make by a scientific invention. So Bachelard and Althusser speak here from a philosophical discovery in practical state. It is there in the scientific method, somehow tacitly at work, but if you try to make it explicit, you often fail and produce something what Bachelard has called a youth of the scientist's knowledge, so his first theoretical assumptions of the world and so on. So very often the scientists themselves fail by concretely naming what philosophy they have produced, and so the task of the philosophers, who always come later, is mainly to free the scientists from their failed attempts to account for their philosophy and to somehow try to give an adequate terminology to what the scientists have actually done. And that can be, I think, widely compared to what happens in the arts. And the situation in the arts, as you may know, is even much more critical. It's not only like in the sciences that scientists are seduced, like Karl Marx, to use a borrowed language to account for his new philosophy and then describe his method in Capital as Hegelian, for example, which Althusser considers to be a major mistake. Artists are even much more seduced to use a borrowed language to account for what they philosophically do in their practice. And that comes from the fact that artists are surrounded by curators. Curators have today mostly the position that in university life administrators have and bureaucracy have. They have a tendency to subject the productive forces to their command. the role of the curator in the art field has shifted dramatically since the 70s. In the 70s, you still had figures, great curators like the Swiss man Harald Zeeman, who had a very high respect for those highly idiosyncratic words and languages that the artists lived in and dealt with, and tried to somehow account for these idiosyncrasies of the artists and treated them with the highest respect. Whereas, like 20 years later, in the 90s, artists were surrounded by curators who just imposed their language upon the art. And so if you did not follow their language and declare your work interactive or participatory or dealing with new materialism or something, you were cooked. So you were forced to speak the language of the curators and to express what you did in the language of theirs, just as today you are, as scientists, forced to express what you do in the language of the administration and account for the points and whatever formal attributes of your research and not of what you actually do. So that was basically how I considered of myself when dealing with artists, protect artists from a borrowed language and remove the obstacles that borrowed language can present to artistic work. To the misrecognition of their own works, because if artists misrecognize what they actually did, then the next work will be considerably weaker than the previous one. It will lack precisely the misrecognized dimension that the previous work had. In the 90s, in the arts, we were already starting to face a development that you today all know, the development of the arts attempting to become more scientific. That could be seen on many levels. For example, in the 90s, many art universities were trying to replace studio work by cultural studies or humanities. So why should you deal with clay or some shit like that, or metal or wood? Read Foucault, and then your artwork will become better. There was a stubborn hostility all of a sudden against the materiality of art. That is something that I found particularly interesting, also in cultural terms, because that already triggered my interest for the role of materiality in the history of ideologies, the role of materiality and hostility against it in religious life. And what I was also wondering about was what development are we facing here? All of a sudden art appeared and presented itself very scholarly. You would have photocopied papers with quotations from great scholars. Art became very heavy-handed, very boring and sad, but claimed to be true. And I asked myself, is truth necessarily so sad? And is all sadness necessarily true? And I also started doubting the narrative that the curators of the 90s were telling, that before artists lived in illusion, they indulged in this material practice full of illusion, but now artists are in the know, now they have read everything, and they know in advance what they are doing, so it's much better now. That's also where a notion of scientific research came in. No, scientific research means that in this understanding that the artists know in advance what they will do, as if scientists always knew in advance what they will do. So also this caricature of science that was implicated in these notions of artistic research I found quite interesting, because the model was mostly boring science and not science as surprising as it can be. As you may remember, Niklas Luhmann once stated that method is precisely what allows the scientist to surprise himself. So art at this time did not become surprising anymore. All these people knew in advance what they would do. That's also how the artworks looked like. And also in the reception you already saw what was meant. You didn't have to look very carefully. You could just say, okay, Foucault, Rossière, yeah, there's Bourdieu, and there was nothing in Tate that would be more than what they knew in advance and what you knew in advance, no surprise. This relationship that I mentioned briefly now between truth, sadness, illusion was also at stake for me to ask myself what a materialist position in philosophy would be with regard to these issues. And as you have maybe seen already on Tuesday, I think if there is a materialist claim in philosophy, it is that there is only one world and the world doesn't fall apart. So it is not true that in order for you to accede to truth, you have to sacrifice happiness or fun or something like that. So all these dualist philosophies that were highly at work in this new curator's language of the 90s, we have to sacrifice fun in order to accede to truth, seemed to me highly metaphysical and anti-materialist, and I wanted to tackle that. And so I started an inquiry concerning the role of illusion, the role of happiness, the role of knowledge with regard to that. So that was the starting point for this little discovery that tackled me and bugged me for many years at this time. I went into this by the help of a French psychoanalyst named Octave Manoni. Probably well known to all readers of Lacanian seminars where Manoni took part, and there are often his statements at the end of Lacan's seminars where Octave Manoni states something. Manoni wrote in 1964 an essay entitled "I know quite well, but still the beliefs." I know quite well, but still the beliefs. To give you an image of what Manoni points at here, starting from experiences from clinical psychoanalytic practice, I want to give you an example that is probably similar to many things that you have already encountered. Imagine a nice afternoon, you sit in a cafe waiting for a friend. You read the newspaper. After a while, the friend appears and he greets you hastily and then grabs your newspaper and said, "Excuse me, I know it's quite silly, but I have to know how this football match ended yesterday." And then he looks at the sports pages. Or, similar example, friend arrives, greets you hastily, grabs your newspaper and says, "Excuse me, I know it's very silly, but I have to read my horoscope for today." What I find interesting here and intriguing is the relationship between the subject and the illusion in this case. It is not this friend's illusion. He knows quite well that this is silly. He knows that this is an illusion. He's not, in a way, a believer of this illusion, but the illusion still exerts a considerable power upon him. He has to do that immediately, even before talking to you, even before reading relevant headlines of the newspaper. So we have a kind of discrepancy here, and that's precisely the discrepancy that Octave Manoni coined the formula for by saying this is a situation of "I know quite well, but still, I know quite well, this is silly, but still I have to." So what we could say here is we have to deal here with the subject and the powerful illusion, but the illusion is not the subject's illusion. He does not believe in this illusion. This is not the case in the illusions that we usually find, and the usual cases of belief. Normally, we find illusions for which we can find subjects, or for which we can find owners. So we find proud owners of certain illusions. Some people say they believe in God, some people say they believe in enlightenment or progress of humanity in the name of reason. Or even after the financial crisis, we find people who say they believe in the self-regulation of the financial markets. In these cases, we would never find somebody arguing like the friend in my example. We would never find a Christian who would say, "Excuse me, I know it's quite silly, but I have to go to church now." You know? There would never be something like that. You know? Or you would never find a neoliberal economist saying, "I know it's quite silly, but it's such fun to act as if I believed in the self-regulation of the financial markets." So, To suggest a rough distinction here, we have to do with illusions with owners, where people proudly declare that these are their illusions, and illusions without owners, where people shamefully declare that they have to follow those illusions which are not theirs. Illusions with owners, illusion without owners. Manoni has a nice terminology for this distinction. He calls the illusions with owners faith. English and French have this very useful particularity here that faith rather only knows a singular. So if you have faith, you mostly only have one faith. If you believe in God, you don't also believe in the self-regulation of the markets or so. But on the other hand, illusions without owners, Manoni calls beliefs, and that merits the plural. Beliefs, we can have many at the same time. We can have the horoscope, the sport result, cosmetics, art, whatever. There can be many beliefs connected with non-owners. Psychoanalytically, we can also from this description already draw a first determination or conclusion. We could say beliefs without owners mostly produce pleasure. So the formula of Manoni can also be rendered as, I know it's quite silly, but it's great fun. I have to read my horoscope, it excites me, it's great fun. Illusions with owners mostly don't produce fun, but people are proud. So people are proud to believe in something great, something they consider greater than themselves. They believe in a great cause, and that makes them proud. So illusions with owners, faith produces self-esteem. Or to render it in a more Freudian language, we could say beliefs are on the level of object libido, faith is on the level of ego libido. What already strikes the eye here, compared to the situation of the arts in the 90s that I described before, is the fact that already here we encounter a very specific relationship between materiality of the illusion and belief. Your friend does not believe in the horoscope, but he has to grab the newspaper and read it immediately. So he has to do this material ritual, this material act. And this corresponds perfectly to Sigmund Freud's account on disavowal in his essay on fetishism from 1927, where Freud makes this very interesting and paradoxical point that the fetish always only occurs when an illusion is abandoned by a subject. So the fetishist abandons a certain illusion, and that's precisely what creates the materiality of the fetish. The material fetish only pops up at the moment when the illusion that the fetish embodies is not anymore believed by the fetishist. So you do not have fetishist faithful, they would not have fetishes. Fetish only pertains to a disbeliever. Or, as we could say in Manoni's language, the fetish is connected to belief and not to faith. That's very important, especially if we consider periods of high material culture with regard to beliefs. So if we look at the Middle Ages and where people build huge cathedrals, we are often somehow seduced to conclude that those guys must have really believed in God if they made these big cathedrals. But if we follow Freud's account, we would rather draw the opposite conclusion. We would say, okay, they built these big cathedrals, so they must have been quite huge disbelievers. They must have abandoned the illusion. That's one of the reasons why Jacques Lacan said in the Middle Ages people were often asked by the priest, please don't. Lacan was aware of this dimension of disbelief in the Middle Ages. The fact that materiality of ideology, if we say so, materiality of belief is connected to disbelief, is not only a finding of Freud, a theoretical finding of Freud, but it can also be practically, it can be seen, observed, practically enacted by certain ideologies. For example, by the ideology of Enlightenment religion. In the 18th century, as you may all know, there was a huge hostility against the materiality of Christian religion. And the reasoning went like this. Well, how can you fall on your knees and say silly prayers that you don't understand? How can you believe that this pleases your God? Is this not silly and slavish? Is a God worth believing in, not beyond such silly rituals? And so a position, a consequent position of enlightenment emerged. You have that in David Hume and in Immanuel Kant, where all these material rituals are dismissed in the name of God and in the name of the true belief in God. So the true faithful, according to David Hume, says, precisely because I believe in God, I don't do any of those silly things. So the belief was connected with not doing the things, of real faith, true faith, expressed in self, precisely by not expressing itself, by not materializing. And the hostility against ritual was precisely the suspicion whoever indulges in the materiality cannot be a real believer. It testifies, it witnesses disbelief if you produce material fetishes of religion. This has been nicely accounted for by the Slovene philosopher Miran Bozovic in his essay, The God of the Transvestites. You find that in Bozovic's book, An Utterly Dark Spot, Miran Bozovic, An Utterly Dark Spot, and there the essay, The God of the Transvestites, renders this deism debate of the 18th century very nicely. We can also draw one conclusion from this account, a historical conclusion that Manoni points at. We can say, obviously, belief comes first. What we find in the oldest cultures is belief. Only later, and not in all cultures, does faith appear. This corresponds also to what German theologist Hans Sundermeier and German cultural theorist Jan Assmann have nicely coined by their distinction between so-called primary and secondary religions. They call primary religions all those religions that are driven by the fear not to venerate enough of the sacred. So primary religions are, for example, polytheist religions, or religions for which almost every bush is sacred. And they are very afraid of maybe taking a bush for profane, which could also be sacred. Or if they're polytheists, they build temples also for the unknown gods, so that they are not offended if they just venerate the gods that they know. This is very different in what Assmann and Sundermeier call secondary religions. Assmann and Sundermeier argue, are driven by the opposite fear. They are always afraid of venerating too much of the sacred. So they drastically have to reduce the number of the gods, ideally to just one, and to exclude all the other gods and destroy them, and especially destroy the ritual practices that are connected to them. Very nice account of this, by the way, early Christian text by Tertullian, church father of Christian religion, around 200, very important figure for Christianity, making it into Latin language, and he has written a beautiful essay on the spectacles, De Spectaculis, and he clearly describes that for Christian people, theater, music, sports, car races, boxing, and so are not allowed. They are pagan rituals, even if the pagans don't know that, but you have just to carefully listen how pagan sports fans or pagan theater goers describe their heroes. They say, the actress is a diva. Tertullian says, there we have it.
There we go.
There we have it. The actress is a diva, that means pagan language, deification of a human being. Or they call the boxer immortal. Tertullian says, obviously this is pagan practice, so no sports, no music, no fun for Christian people. Sadness. But with the hope of a big revenge, we just have to wait, but one day all these car racers and Epicurean philosophers will burn when the youngest day of judgment arrives, and that will be our spectacle, Tertullian says. So, in this confrontation of primary and secondary religion, we also see one thing, that secondary religion not only reduces the number of gods, but also forms the gods much more according to the needs of the human believers. So these are gods that we can really believe in, and those gods must be shaped in such a way that we can really have faith in them. We must not believe in silly gods, like the little Eros, baby god who shoots around with arrows so that people fall in love, a foolish god, and so. This is a very important feature of this cultural development, that the gods have to comply more to human standards, human faith standards, that they have to increasingly comply to that. And that, of course, is also always connected with the loss of materiality. The gods lose their shapes, they lose their sexes, and so on. They lose also their age. This god is almost invisible and infinitely old and infinitely wise, and so on, and doesn't have sex anymore. So all this materiality gets lost, and also the representability, the material representability of these gods gets then lost. For the Greeks, gods were perfectly visible. You took an Olympic Games winner in spear throwing, and that was more or less a kind of good image of Apollo. And if you wanted to have Venus, you took some of the best prostitutes or the most popular theater actresses, and that was more or less Venus. So the visibility of the divine was not a problem for the Greeks. And that's precisely because this was a primary religion and not a secondary religion, and the gods were not shaped according to the imperative that people should be able to have faith in them. And that triggered in the 19th century always the question that bothered scholars of ancient Greece. These scholars were completely astonished about the foolishness of the Greek gods, and so they were completely astonished and said, did the Greeks really believe in their gods? French historian Paul Venn has written a nice book about this problem, but I think Venn hasn't found a very good answer to the question. The perfect answer has been given by Friedrich Engels in his book The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, where Engels says the scholars in the 19th century believed much more in the Greek gods than the Greeks themselves did. And I think this is the perfect answer. So Greek scholars in the 19th century were faithful people, and therefore they wondered how gods could be so silly and sexually envious and so on. Whereas for the Greeks in the primary religion of belief, this was not a problem at all. So the scholars believed more in these gods. So what this accounts for, in a way, is a very interesting image of cultural development. It is not that mankind first believes into illusions and then later gets a bit smarter and abandons a few of those beliefs. What we find here is precisely the contrary. We have first rich material cultures that witness the abandonment of belief, and then we have a process where people become more faithful, hostile against materiality, because they want to have illusions that they can believe in. And we have a process of culture becoming more serious and more faithful and more secondary religious. And so we could say what presents itself as a kind of increase of knowledge, now we don't believe in these silly things anymore, is in fact an increase of identification with the illusion. So we only believe in those illusions that we really can identify with. We only have gods that we can really understand, not foolish gods, children gods, and so on. By the way, that's also an interesting development, not only that the gods become asexual, but the gods also become older in the history of mankind. Early cultures also have children gods, late culture only have very old, wise gods. So I think from these psychoanalytic considerations we can gain a very interesting hint on cultural development in history. We can say what represents itself as a kind of enlightenment process, increase of knowledge, abandonment of illusions that were previously believed in, is in fact the opposite. It is the disabandonment of illusion. It is a process in which illusion gets more and more believed in, which means that illusion gets more and more subjected to the norms of faith, so that people can really believe in it. And here we encounter another interesting point concerning knowledge. So the knowledge that this is an illusion is apparently not a late development. The knowledge that this is an illusion already was obviously necessary for the materiality of the early culture, because this culture already functioned according to the mode of, I know quite well that this is silly, but let's make a funny wooden figure of some silly god. It already implied the abandonment of illusion, and this knowledge was the prerequisite of indulging in the materiality, of making these statues of the silly gods. Otherwise, these fetishes would not have occurred. But at some point, this knowledge can be taken as a reason for precisely acting in the opposite way. And you say, okay, apparently in previous times people did not have this knowledge, but now we have the knowledge that this is all silly, and therefore we don't do that anymore. So from this same knowledge, you can draw the opposite conclusions. You can either indulge in this silly fun, or you can say, oh no, let's draw the ascetic conclusion and not anymore indulge in this fun. I myself have encountered these two possibilities when I observed two similar but still different cultures when I was commuting between two Austrian cities, Vienna and Linz, in the 90s. And you know, in many countries in Western Europe you have this Carnival's Tuesday, where people sometimes dress in masks and so on. And I observed that in Linz, the kind of second city in Austria, smaller city, not considering itself the center of the world, people were happily indulging in carnival rituals on this Carnival Tuesday. Already in the morning, when you went to the bakery's shop, you would find a Mr. Spock that gives you the bread rolls, and then later on you had the vampire as your taxi driver, and then in the afternoon you would find whole manned balloons entering the cafe, and so people had a lot of fun in being masked all the day, and almost all classes of society were indulging in this. In Vienna you had that very, very rarely, maybe only for an evening party or so, but not during the day, and I asked myself, why can that be so? And I think, at least to me, the explanation seemed plausible, that it stemmed from the fact that Vienna people suffer more from self-esteem because they consider themselves to be the center of the world. And then they think, okay, silly people in the provinces, probably they don't know that this is silly, but we are educated, civilized people in the capital of Western Europe. We don't do these silly things. This is against our pride. So, and we know, and therefore we don't do it. And then they assume that Linz people are more stupid, they don't know this is silly, and so they still believe it and they do it. But of course, this is not, you don't have to be a psychoanalyst to know that. Of course the Linz people also only do it because they know it is silly. You know? If they didn't know that this is silly, they won't have any fun about it. You know? Only if you know that wearing a silly mask is a silly thing, you can laugh about it. You know? So already here you find a key materialist point. Knowledge and fun are not opposites, but fun requires knowledge. And seeing through the illusion, otherwise you cannot have fun from the illusion. Excuse me. What you can observe in this example also is something that occurs very often when one culture encounters the other, and when one culture observes the belief practices of the other culture. For example, when European anthropologists come to some Oceanic or African tribe and see some magicians or voodoo artists at work, there is a certain illusion that always pops up on the side of the faithful observers, because what they do is that they assume that the others' belief were their faith. So the Vienna people look at the Linz people and say, okay, they do these silly things, so they must have faith in these silly things. This seems to witness for their faith in the silly things. They do not draw the conclusion that they say, okay, probably they know that's silly and so they derive fun from it. No, they think, okay, if they do it, they don't know. And we know, and therefore we don't do it. So knowledge is here taken as a pretext for ascetic practice and ascetic position, and fun practice is considered as lacking of knowledge. This was also the issue in a debate between an anthropologist and a philosopher. You may know Ludwig Wittgenstein, in his years in Cambridge in the 1930s, encountered the classical work by anthropologist James George Fraser, and he wrote a couple of notes, which I think is a wonderful introduction into anthropology in a way. A few critical comments and remarks on Fraser's Golden Bough. And basically, I put the things very roughly here, the argument between the two goes like that. Fraser says, in history of mankind, we have a sequence of steps. First, mankind is magic, then mankind becomes religious, and then mankind becomes scientific. And magic and scientific stage resemble each other a bit more than religious, because both the magic and the scientific man believe that the same effects will derive from the same causes. Just the magic people don't know which causes and which effects, so they get it wrong, but basically they have a kind of natural science understanding of the world. And that's the reason why they do magic, whereas we, scientific people, we do technical practices. So they make sun dances and we switch on the light in a way when it's dark. And Ludwig Wittgenstein criticized this position on both sides. In the first place, Wittgenstein said, also the savages know that magic is just magic. They don't have faith in magic. There's never such a thing as a faithful magician. The magician always deals with magic in a way of, I know quite well, but still. So that can be clearly seen, says Wittgenstein, when you observe tribes who do a sun dance, for example. They only do the sun dance in the morning before the sun comes, but when they look for something at night, they don't do a sun dance, but then they burn torches so that they have light, so they can clearly distinguish between a magical and a technical practice, and they have a technical practice for that issue for which Fraser thought the magical practice was serving for. Or other example, Wittgenstein comments upon the voodoo practice. So if you have so-called savages who stamp little dolls that represent their enemies, Wittgenstein says the same savage, when the real enemy approaches, doesn't do voodoo, but takes an arrow and bow and shoots the other. So they can clearly distinguish between magical and real practice, and that means they know quite well that magic is just magic. And Wittgenstein says, on the other hand, it's also not true what Fraser assumes, that since we know that magic is just magic and silly, therefore we don't do magic and only do technical practices. Of course, we also do other things, and Wittgenstein gives very nice examples of himself. He says, for example, when I sit at a dinner and some person indulges in a very annoying talk and laughs very loudly, I start, and I even have to do that, I start biting my own lips as if I could shut the other up like this. So he does a little mouth voodoo, so to say, of shutting his own lips up as if he could silence the other by that. But of course, Wittgenstein says, I don't believe in this, I just have to do it somehow compulsively. This was precisely the point where I tried to connect his findings by Manoni and Wittgenstein with a cultural theory, which I find a very intriguing and revolutionary theory, provided in 1938 by Dutch scholar Johann Huizinga. Johann Huizinga, who wrote this book, Homo Ludens, Plain Man. And Huizinga starts precisely from the same point. He says, we must not conclude from the strong fascination of the game that gaming people would completely succumb to the illusion that is at work in the game. And we must never believe that the playing child is so stupid not to understand that the game is a game. He has a very nice example where a friend has a 4-year-old son, and the father comes home in the afternoon and the son has arranged 4 chairs like a train, and he sits in front on the first chair and he's the locomotive of the train. And the father kisses the child, and then the child says, "Oh father, you must not kiss the locomotive, otherwise the cars of the train don't believe it's serious." So it's not he who believes that this is a train, he just deceives the cars of the train. No? This is very nice how the child was aware of this illusion of the game. And the same Huizinga says about so-called savages. He says, as much as savages appear captured by their rituals to the anthropologist, we must never conclude that they lack the knowledge that this is just a game. So Huizinga develops a very interesting first thesis, which says gaming contains a very specific attitude, an attitude of total commitment. But, and I think that's the revolutionary thesis of Huizinga, we can only derive this total commitment from a better knowledge that this is just a game. So only when people know that this is just a game, they can become so committed. If they would forget that this is just a game and believe that this is normal, profane reality, they would act as boringly as people normally act in profane reality. So it's only in the game that we embrace foreigners and kiss them if our soccer team has scored a goal. This does not occur when we learn, for example, that our salaries have been raised by 5%. So only in the game we have what Huizinga calls sacred seriousness. And this is really, I think, revolutionary and coincides with the best insights of Wittgenstein and Manoni and Freud, that this sacred seriousness depends on a better knowledge that sees through the illusion. So if you don't see through the illusion, you cannot become captured by sacred seriousness. And to illustrate this first thesis by Johann Huizinga, I want to refer to a visual example, of which I'm very grateful to Sverker Ludin, who illustrated my thesis on his homepage with this video example from YouTube, top 10 angry players. So please look at what happens with players when they fall into sacred seriousness.
It's late.
Yes, you can see here precisely the justification of Manon's thesis. Even if you know these things, you can hardly believe your eyes seeing that this is like this. So you know quite well, but still you may be surprised that it works like this. And what you can also see is a perfect illustration of what German classic poet Friedrich Schiller referred to when stating that men are only fully human when they play. So this is full humanity exerted. And psychoanalytically speaking, you can also see here that this holy sphere, or the sphere of the sacred of the game, introduces us into a state where ultimate joy and ultimate pain can be it's very difficult to distinguish them. It's very difficult to say if this boy suffers or if this is ultimate pleasure. No? And so I think here you can also come close to the definition of jouissance, enjoyment. Enjoyment is precisely this enormous passion that is very hard to distinguish as if, whether it's a joyful or painful passion. So what you definitely see is that knowing that it is a game does not avoid people being totally sucked in by the game and falling under what Heusinger calls the spell of the game. So this boy is totally under the spell of the game. The game becomes like his demon, and it's a situation or a state of mind that can be compared to descriptions of obsession or possession that we have from anthropologists from certain rituals. So also among civilized people, and not only among infantile players, but also among adult players, this occurs very often. Computer companies report that the most frequent cause of computer defects is precisely that also adult people punish their computers for little malfunctions and destroy them even more and damage them more like this. So, in the first place, Heusinger says that knowing that it is just a game allows us to enter the play sphere and to enter a state of mind where we are totally passionate and totally caught up. This is a reaction that we would never find at someone indulging in a profane practice, sitting in front of your computer and learning that your salaries have been cut down for 50% or that you are sacked tomorrow. Even that would not lead you to such a behavior, I bet. And so even the saddest news that you can get still keep you in a kind of balanced state of mind. It would be very sad, you might cry, yes, or hit the table, but you would not act that out for minutes like this guy. So this only is a specificity that only pertains to the play sphere. And that is only opened up by the better knowledge that game is just a game. That's the revolutionary thesis of Heusinger. So better knowledge is the condition for the magic spell of the game. The compulsion to play, the compulsion to shout is only possible under the condition that you know that it's just a game. So the compulsive are far from being naive or stupid. You only find compulsives in the know. So to put it a bit psychoanalytically, we can say what sacred seriousness is composed of is ambivalence. And this compulsion, as Freud describes it, is always the effect of an ambivalence. Joy and suffering cannot be divided anymore, and so you have one and the same practice that in a way satisfies both needs. Need for enjoyment and the need for suffering are satisfied by one and the same action. That's also what Freud describes for obsessional neurotic action, for obsessive action. Precisely this fact that in play people can accede to this higher passion which is inaccessible to them in profane life, this leads Heusinger to his revolutionary idea that play is at the origin of all culture. All cultural practices derive from play, and this celebration dimension of play impregnates all cultural practices, be it religion, art, sports. You always have these typical practices that pertain to play, that you have to somehow limit a playground, to draw a white line. Here is the playground, here is the profane outside. You have to mark the time. Now it is game, now the game is over. And that is the crucial operation for constituting the play sphere, and that's exactly the same in religion, in art, and in sports. So Heusinger says very nicely, there is no big difference between a religious temple and a tennis court. They always have this lineation marks that delineate the play sphere. So high passion opened up by knowledge, and that is the origin of all culture, first thesis of Heusinger. But then Heusinger introduces a second thesis, and that I found particularly interesting. He says, despite the fact that play is at the origin of every culture, there's a tendency in culture to erase the play dimension in culture. And then Heusinger asks himself, why does that occur? That's, I think, the most intriguing philosophical question. And in a way, you could say that the greatest theorists in the last 100 years have constantly been bothered by precisely this question. It is not only Heusinger who thinks about this intrusion of the aesthetic ideals into culture, but this has been equally Friedrich Nietzsche with his genealogy of morals. This has been Sigmund Freud with his study of modern nervosity and modern civilization. Wilhelm Reich with the outcome of the aesthetic culture. So many of the best theories in the last 100 years bother precisely with these questions. How did a funny, playful, joyful culture turn into a silly, serious but joyless culture? Heusinger investigates that with regard to a lot of examples. He, for example, investigates fashion and tries to account for the fact why male fashion became so boring. Somewhere in the 19th century, male fashion that until then was very colorful. Men in France in the 18th century wore high heels and they were dressed up a bit like women and colorful and funny, but then all of a sudden they're just only gray and white. Women remain a bit more colorful, but if you see contemporary American movies, also the women already succumb to grayness and colorless life. And that's exactly what Heusinger finds stunning and paradoxical, and finds that cultural theory has to account for this. So we have to account for the disappearance of play in culture that has been founded by play. Sigmund Freud has tried to account for that also in another essay of his, which I found very revealing. It's the 1907 essay, Obsessive Action and Religious Ritual, where Sigmund Freud first draws some conclusion from the comparison between obsessive actions and religious ritual in order to comment upon what obsessive neurosis is. But then the explanative relationship is reversed, and then Freud starts drawing some conclusions about the cultural history of rituals that he can derive from his analysis of the obsessional neurotic. And what is to be observed in the obsessional neurotic is that the obsessional neurotic finds obsessive practices that always are founded on ambivalence. So you have always one and the same action that satisfies love and hate, for example, or that satisfies a need for enjoyment and punishment. So, for example, the obsessive eater has a desire for food, but also punishes himself by eating, so that he gets very tired and can't get anything done. And so, or the alcoholic not only loves alcohol, but also wants to annihilate the alcohol. And so, it's always an ambivalent action that leads into compulsion and addiction. But what is to be observed, Freud says, is that obsessive action very often tends towards miniaturization. So what starts maybe as a big obsessive action becomes a bit smaller and smaller until to a point where total avoidance occurs. So, for example, the obsessive has a thought about some colleague whom he loves but also secretly hates. And so when he thinks of the colleague, he has all of a sudden the fear that something might happen to the colleague. It's precisely because he wishes that something might happen to the colleague. And then he thinks, and to prevent that, he says, may God bless him. But then all of a sudden, after saying that 2 or 3 times, he says, he makes a Freudian slip and says, may God not bless him. And in order to avoid that Freudian slip, he makes the formula shorter, and instead of saying the full words, he just says the initial letters. Yeah? May M, God bless him, so M-G-B-H, something. So by abbreviating, he tries to preserve the positive character of the formula, but then maybe also some Freudian slip may occur with the letters, and then all of a sudden he can only shut up with regard to this. So avoidance replaces the ritual. That's what obsessive neurosis tends towards. And Freud says maybe also in religious life we have this, where positive cults, rituals are tendentially, after a while, replaced by avoidances. So when you have early religions that indulge in big meals and eating for days, later religions will just avoid food, for example, or avoid alcohol. So ascetic practices, negative cults, as Durkheim would have called it, always occur later with regard to a previous obsessive practice. So I come to my last point. This disappearance of the play dimension and of the joy dimension in culture, as you can see, was my initial question with regard to the arts. And when I asked myself, how could it come that in the 90s people considered themselves to be in the know and felt justified to become so boring, I somehow recognized again this description in what Heusinger, in a larger scale, described with regard to cultural history. And from my point of departure now, this was not a question as Adorno and Horkheimer would have asked it, a question of a dialectics of enlightenment. How does something that starts reasonable reverse into unreason or into technologically skilled barbarism? It was rather the opposite question. How could something that started as belief, or as superstition if you want to, end up in faith? Is there a kind of dialectics of superstition, a dialectics of compulsive happy gaming that somehow leads up to avoidance and aesthetic practice and this arrogance of the civilized that allows them not to play? So is this maybe a development that leads to this asceticism that we observe here? What I wanted to reveal here is also a dimension that even within a more ascetic culture, even within our culture, still is at work in many everyday practices. So we can see the hostility against ritual not only in the fact that many rituals are being destroyed, that we, for example, abandon certain habits of clothing or certain habits of politeness and so on in our culture, what Marcuse would have called repressive desublimation. it is also that we get more and more blind for the fact that we still respect some of these practices. We just are not aware of this fact. Just as Wittgenstein pointed out that we also still commit some magical acts, but we are not aware of that. So imagine, for example, that you are invited for a funeral, and there's a mourning widow at the open grave, and you want to express your sincere compassion and sympathy with the widow, but since you mean it so sincerely, you grab the hand a bit too fast and you stumble, and all of a sudden you fall into the open grave together with the mourning widow. What would happen? That would be very, very shameful, and all of the community would burst out into laughter, and the whole funeral might be ruined. But ask yourself psychoanalytically, what in yourself would punish you for that? Is it superego? Yeah? Does superego say, oh, you had bad intentions and now you're punished? No, it's not. You know quite well you did not mean badly. You had sincere intentions and you just made a little mistake, and unfortunately it looked so silly. The appearance was silly. It was not the intention. Superego always looks at the intention. You are punished for the intention, even if you don't commit the act. Superego even punishes you more for the bad intention than for the bad action. But what this is work here is that some instance of observation within you punishes you for that silly action, not for the intention, but only for the appearance. It looked very silly, and that's shameful, and that's why you feel ashamed. So this, in a short story, led me to this discovery of what I have called the naive observer. Psychoanalysis has dealt a lot with superego and ego ideas, so there were two instances, two agencies of internal observation to which subjects are subjected. But we have to recognize that there is also another instance or agency of observation, the naive observer, which is precisely at work in these practices where we care for the appearance and where we feel ashamed if we didn't manage to uphold the appearance. And this is very important, I think, with regard to the accounts for pleasure, but also for other practices in culture, and especially also for ideological practices. It's not only pleasant, but also very shameful practices. Just consider, for example, of the character played, the hero played by Charles Bronson in Sergio Leone's Western Once Upon a Time in the West. This young man is traumatized by the fact that the gangsters around Henry Fonda put his brother on his shoulders and hanged him. And if the younger brother could have managed to stand longer, the older brother would have survived longer. So you can inflict a feeling of guilt upon a person by an appearance. That's the appearance that these cynical gangsters create, and that can traumatize a person, and the whole movie in a way is the movie of this revenge of the traumatized, and the revenge can also again be made only by another appearance, by giving the harmonica back to the dying Henry Fonda. So this is, I think, at stake in a number of ideological practices that consist of this enforced play, when the powerful force the powerless to play something, and this inflicts something, a kind of guilt that is dependent on the instance of the naive observer who cannot account for that otherwise, I think. So to come to a conclusion, I think what bothered me in this book, you have seen, was this intrusion of aesthetic ideas into culture, and I tried to account for that with regard to the relationship of belief and faith, faith being hostile to belief, either destroying belief practices or rendering us blind for that. I think this account is not wrong, but I think just to account for certain ideological phenomena that we face today, this account is not completely sufficient. Because take an ideological formation, as we often see today, this panic formation that says, please sacrifice everything immediately for health, security, environment, whatever. This injunction to sacrifice everything immediately Is this belief? Is this faith? This is very difficult to say. It is neither belief nor faith. We never say, I know it's quite silly, but now I sacrifice everything for health. No, we don't have this distance, but we also don't have the distance of, let's say, a good communist who asks himself every day, am I really a good communist? The communist feels himself or herself a bit remote from the ideal, and that's a distance in which this engagement dwells. You know you will never be the perfect communist, you just strive to be one, or the perfect religious believer or whatever. So you're always at a distance from your ideal. And I think this subject formation that we face today, sacrifice everything immediately for something, this does not have these distances that belief and faith have. Belief has the distance, it's silly, but still. Faith has the distance, I want to arrive at the ideal, but I'm still not the ideal, and I will never be completely there. Paranoia, on the contrary, is a subject formation that has this character, immediately everything, this absoluteness. You find that in the persons who believe themselves to be Jesus, for example, and when they are Jesus, they have to kill their parents because Satan hides behind their parents. And so this is much more typical for the different subject formation, which I call paranoia, this immediate urge and this not allowing the subjects for any distance, neither belief nor faith distance. But what can be said is that paranoia emerges precisely from the relationship between belief and faith. And it's precisely the point of this perspective illusion that I described before, when the civilized looks at the savage and sees the savage doing something magic, for example. And when this perspective illusion occurs that the civilized thinks, okay, magic must be the faith of the other, he must believe that this works, therefore he does it. Then I think we are at the starting point of paranoia, because, and you can see that very often in the relationship between civilized and savages also today, the usual relationship between civilized and savages is first pity. Oh, these poor fools, they don't have science, they commit magic acts, what silly idiots they are, they need our education and so on. And in the second place, this pity reverses into envy. You know? Oh, these savages, they have really magic and fun. We had to renounce magic, we had to acknowledge that we don't have magic powers, but they didn't have to acknowledge that, and it still seems to work. You know? And so they seem to be omnipotent, they kill their enemies by voodoo, they really drop dead because they don't know that it doesn't function. You know? So their lack of knowledge makes magic really work. So they live in this omnipotence of thought, as Freud called it. So they are like pre-castrative. We were castrated. We had to acknowledge that our thoughts cannot kill. Sadly enough, we are so impotent in our thought. But they are not. And so we envy them for this non-castration. And that, I think, is precisely psychoanalytically the point where paranoia emerges, where you see non-castration on the side of the other. And paranoid measures are always made in order to castrate the other in order to uncastrate ourselves. You can see the same mechanism also today with refugees. In the first place, they were poor refugees, all these poor people losing their homes, but now all of a sudden they are pre-castrated, they have very long dicks and molest all women with their sexual aggressiveness, and we have to whatever, jail them to avoid that and castrate them. So I think, to account briefly for this, it is a crucial problem to account for this panic aggressivity against pleasure, and to account for this ideological form of paranoia that I find predominant in culture today. And I think we have to struggle against this on many levels. This hostility against joyful material practices, just as smoking, for example, I think has also to be acknowledged in its value as a material ideological practice. Here again, I'm profoundly Althusserian. Ideology does not consist of ideas but of material practices. And I think if one does not see that the smoking prohibitions are an attempt of complete liquidation of the political left in Europe, then one has neither understood what the left was, nor one hasn't understood what ideology was. And I think CIA has understood it better, because as you may know, the smoking regulations have been designed by a so-called think tank, which is one of the 16 departments of CIA. And this is not even a secret, they did it quite openly. So I think they understood it well, what to tackle in order to do this. And last point, in order to get out of these predicaments of paranoia by which we're surrounded today, I think we have to see it as a political issue to reinforce the cultural practices and rituals that allow people for getting at a little distance from their paranoid obsessions. And there are, I would say, two kinds of these techniques. On the one hand, we have techniques of politeness. That's a very nice technique of getting at an easy distance, playful distance. And on the other hand, we have techniques of faith, of commitment. That's the side that Slavoj Žižek maybe not always luckily pursued when he insisted on the role of Christian faith. I do not follow him with regard to Christianity, but I think faithful commitments also allow for a certain distance of the subject towards its ideology, and we have to reinforce these practices in order to battle against this increasing paranoia culture, which I think is a profoundly reactionary tendency. I think paranoid subjects are perfect slaves, and that we have to avoid. Thank you very much.
So, thank you so much for a completely fascinating lecture, but slightly bedazzling. So I have lots of questions, and I hope maybe we can talk about some of them later. So here's just one. So if I understand you correctly, drawing from Heisinger, you're saying the delusion of the game makes it possible for a passionate attachment, for a commitment. That it's, and the example in a way, it's the person, the player, who is kind of astonishingly committed and to the game. It's possible, you claim, or it's easier if there is an element of play. That is the proposition. So that, and then it made me wonder, and so there is a question, whether you think that the rise of the kind of extreme right-wing proposition in some parts of the world, I mean everywhere for different reasons, but certainly in Britain and in America with Trump, in America and figures like Farage and Boris Johnson, might have to do with the fact that certainly Boris Johnson and Farage have had famously sort of clownish quality to their performance, to the point that... Hello? That it has been commented on in the press, and of course on the left it was very much, you know, how can this be that people can be committing to such clownish, idiotic performances? But I'm wondering whether indeed this would speak to your point about the importance of play.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. But just to put the first point right, I was claiming not that illusion leads into commitment, but on the contrary, that seeing through the illusion is the precondition for the commitment or for the passionate attachment. So this is the intriguing point in Heisinger. If I try to apply that to the examples that you pointed, I would say, of course, we have also to deal with the fact that these politicians are figures of media reality. They are, so to say, hyper-real. I use Baudrillard's notion here, which means you cannot understand this reality unless you reflect upon the media surrounding by which they feel observed and for which they perform in such a way. So they are effects of private television, of shortened attention spans that private television has brought about, and in which you can only make points by being entertained and funny and having one single trigger that somehow attracts attention. I think if you just held the camera on them, not for 1 minute, but for 5 minutes, these people would completely look different and foolish. So I think alone the length of interviews that, or of speech transmissions that television allows, changes the character of the politicians that we see. And it is a television that assumes that people only have like 30 seconds attention span that produce such politicians. So I think it is a political struggle to fight for public television where people can speak in long sentences and where they are listened and where not everything is interrupted after a few seconds. I think that's also a struggle in universities. So I think fight for lectures that last for more than an hour and for the expectation that students can deal with such a thing. Don't succumb to this ideology of the bureaucrats. Our today's students, they are constantly video gaming, they can't understand a word that goes longer than 10 minutes or so. I think this is the same reactionary ideology in the form of the thing. Second point, of course, with regard to these strange politicians is, I think, a question that Max Weber raises with regard to charisma. And I think, again, it is an idealist assumption to which many of the left have succumbed, that if you are rational and if you try to bring an argument forward, you have to be boring and colorless, and that's not true. You can be very glamorous and funny, even as Gregor Gysi in Germany, for example. He's always very precise to the point, but also very humorous. All his speeches in parliament are a delight and very funny. Or you can also act like Sarah Wagenknecht in a way, who is glamorous and really a figure with character, and she has got something to say. And I think the left has very long indulged in this metaphysical division between truth and pleasure, and chosen what they considered to be truth and accepted to be boring. And I think this is a very bad and idealist position, and we pay the price for this by precisely inviting those who make then the opposite choice and say, okay, you're so boring with your truth, so I'm at least funny, vote for me, and then people choose that. There's a kind of materialist truth to that, I would say.